Hi, I'm Akbar. I'm a developer advocate at Figma, and this is Bridging the Gap, where a developer and a designer have a conversation about collaboration and how we can make that process better. Today, I'm here with Tom. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name's Tom. I'm an advocate as well on the team here, and I come from a design background. So for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, I've been working as a designer, and I also do a little bit of web development too, but not at Akbar's developer level.
Well, so one thing that you and I have been talking about recently is working with data when it comes to design. And it's something that, as an engineer, I'm thinking about a lot, but I don't think I've ever really realized how much of the design process is affected by this.
Yeah, I think when you think about data, the most obvious thing that you might think about is like the content in your design. And so these are like the words. Sometimes that's like words that is part of your UI. Sometimes it's user generated content where you're like, it's an article. Somebody's going to enter something into like a content management system and you have to surface that content. All this to say that it's content that's sometimes outside of your control. And so there's a lot of variability that can come with that, that you sometimes need to account for or compensate for in the design.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty crucial, especially when you're looking at that data, to work with your engineers to understand the type of data that you have to begin with, as well as just taking a look at the data set overall. Can you tell us about a time where, like, understanding the data was really crucial to working on the design?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like an everyday thing for a lot of designers in terms of if you're working on a product that needs to be localized, you might be dealing with, a different font to handle a different character set in another language. Um, and those are all things that you should account for in your design. There's uh, like a common kind of sentiment around placeholder text in designs. You've probably heard these things that say like, don't use lorem ipsum is not a good reflection of like the actual content that is going to be in your design. And I think that, like, if you are working at a very, like, low fidelity early on in the design process, lorem ipsum is, like, fine because it's just, like, it fills up the design, makes it feel a little bit more realistic. But as you start increasing the fidelity of those designs and start getting closer to actually building something, you really need to start bringing in, like, a realistic depiction of the design or the content that you're gonna have in the design, um, because you kinda don't wanna find out that you haven't accounted for that stuff when you actually go and build it.
Yeah, one thing that I kind of remember dealing with a lot is having a design that didn't really take into account how long a name can be or what kind of information we're showing, and so, like, the information would get truncated, and then the app that we're producing, like, would make the designers really angry in terms of, like, "You're not showing the data that we thought you were gonna show."
Yeah, it's not even just about, like, the name being longer, it's also just, like, even some languages tend to be much longer, and so, like, if you, are truncating after one line, you might actually be, like,
Mhm.
obfuscating, like, a bunch of information that's actually really important for somebody, and then it's not just, like, how that information fits within the design, you also have things that you're thinking about, like, form validation when somebody fills out a form, and so you might be thinking, like, "Oh, we wanna make sure that the person enters, like, more than one letter for a name or something," but, in certain cultures, a letter might actually be a single character,
Yeah,
and so that's not a good experience if somebody goes and tries to, like, submit a form and they can't because they haven't been able to just enter their own name.
and this is something where, like, that conversation between designers and developers is really crucial because there are some aspects of that that I haven't been thinking about as an engineer, right? Like, I'm probably following some patterns that I learned when I started building things, but I'm not thinking about the context of where this thing exists in the design or how it looks in the entire process. And so it's really important for us to be able to have that combo and be able to understand the needs of the data. Um, and sometimes, especially when you're early on in the project, that kind of brings us to being able to adjust that. Like, sometimes we don't have the data that we need,
Yes.
and I need to figure out what kind of data I need to collect. I need to figure out what kind of data I should be collecting. And I can't do that on my own in terms of I can come up with some stuff, but maybe I'm not getting everything that you need for the experience that you're thinking about.
There's times where, you've got, like, a set of data from your users, which could include, like, their address and their country, and, like, a lot of that stuff feels like you could get a good handle on it, but if you're designing something like, um an analytics tool, or you're doing something like an experience that doesn't exist before that relies on some sort of data, especially data that like users are going to input,
Mhm.
um, that brings a degree of variability where it's like, if you don't have that data, then how do you kind of like design an experience for it, not knowing what it's going to be? I think you and I were kind of like talking at one point about like, well, what could some of those experiences look like? And the example that I was thinking of is like if you were designing a mapping app and you were trying to figure out how you could make that experience better for somebody.
Yeah.
If this is a map to help somebody like navigate in a car, you might be thinking about maybe we can tell them that there's construction up ahead, that
Yeah.
there's a police that's doing speed radar, or there's an accident. And that data set might not exist. And so not only do you have to think about like try to anticipate what that data might be,
Yeah.
you actually might have to design a whole experience for people to submit that.
Yeah.
And then once they submit it, that's really the only way that you're going to be able to like assess the volume or magnitude of the how little or how much data you're dealing with.
Yeah. And, like, I can see that also changing the way that we're thinking about the design, right? Like, I think one of the things that we were talking about in this example was, let's say we're starting to collect all this information about speed traps, about, um, accidents, about any sort of, like, obstacle that's on your route. How do we show that in a way that doesn't overwhelm the experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have a really large data set and you just sort of like take this like all of these things are like going to be on your route from point A to point B, then now all of a sudden the experience of using the product might get like really noisy because there's just like all of these things shouting at you for attention. So you might decide to like only show that information within like a certain sort of like radius of where you are, and only if it's like up ahead on the road. But there's no way to kind of like know, I don't know, the intensity of how much
Mhm.
information that you need to show until you kind of like have it.
Yeah.
And so, one of the examples that I was thinking of from my work was a project that I worked on early on at Figma,
Uh-huh.
where we were building a project about design system analytics. This was to give um, people who manage design systems some insight into how their libraries were being used across the
Mhm.
organization in Figma. And when we went to start that project, we had a bunch of like early ideas of what kind of visualizations might be useful to somebody,
Yeah.
but we actually didn't have the underlying data
Yeah.
to produce those visuals. So one of the things that I found really valuable about that experience was that the engineers that we were working with on that project were involved from the beginning to really understand like the problem that we were trying to solve. And then we had a like a back and forth discussion to
Yeah.
figure out like, okay, there's all of these different visualizations. What are the common denominators that would allow us to produce any one of those visualizations so that we can figure out what data do we need to capture
Yeah.
to drive those things?
Yep. And then once you started collecting that data, did it affect the way that you were thinking about the design?
Yeah. So early on, we had this idea that in the Figma context,
Mhm.
somebody publishes a library and then different people or teams within their organization use those libraries. And we wanted to give a sense of like which libraries were being used more or less than others. And so we had this idea of like having kind of like the stacked bar chart where like the library that's used most would take
Yep.
up more space in the bar chart. And so we ended up doing some early sketches. And if you want, we can take a look at what those sketches look like.
Yeah, let's take a look at that.
So here are some of those early sketches, and you can see that like we've got a breakdown by library, and then above we had kind of like this aggregate view where you can see all of the libraries stacked up, and we thought, okay, this would be like a really useful visualization.
Yeah.
But of course, we didn't actually have that data yet. So one of the things that we did was before we built any front end,
Uh-huh.
the engineers had offered up, well, why don't we actually ship some code to production
Yeah.
that would allow us to start capturing that
Yeah.
data, and then we'll be able to like look at a more realistic depiction of what that looks like
Yeah.
before we get too far into the designs that we were working on.
Yeah, and I can see that being, like, a really good call, especially if it dramatically changes the way that you were thinking about the design. So what happened in this scenario?
So we ended up starting to capture about 2 or 3 weeks of data,
Uh-huh.
and we had started earmarking some customers that we thought would be good fit in terms of like different types of products, different size companies, and then we reached out to some of our sort of like design system champions that would care about
Mhm.
something like this to sort of like bring them in to influence some of the things that
Yeah.
we were thinking of, and got their permission to build a dashboard
Yeah.
with their data so that we could, without actually doing the design work,
Mhm.
get one of the data scientists on our
Yeah.
team to visualize all of these different types of visualizations that we kind of like were thinking about
Yeah.
in a tool that wasn't in our UI, but
Yeah.
like we could actually put a bunch of different graphs and
Uh-huh.
interactive charts in front of the customer to sort of say like, does this tell a story
Yeah.
that's useful to you? Um, and like just take them through that and almost kind of like a user test, but without them actually using the end experience that you were designing. So it was a very, very early user test.
Yeah, it sounds like a really scrappy way to kind of get a chance to understand whether or not this thing is gonna be useful for your customers.
Yeah, and so we got a lot of great feedback, and there was definitely things that popped up during that. So one of our larger customers ended up having something like thousands of libraries across their entire organization. And so when we went back and looked at some of those like early stacked bar charts that we were thinking of in these like early concepts,
Yeah.
it starts getting to the point where like, wait, if we have to like represent 1,000 different libraries on
Yeah.
that bar chart, the visualization doesn't really tell you much
Yeah.
because you have all of these like little slivers. It's like
Uh-huh.
hard to hover over.
Uh-huh.
And we ended up kind of abandoning that idea to kind of say like maybe that's not the right way to depict this information.
Yeah.
And so what was good about that was that allowed us to kind of say we already know what
Uh-huh.
visualizations in the little user test that we did resonate with people.
Yeah.
Then we could put like a more front end polished version of that in front of the same customers,
Uh-huh.
get some feedback, and then actually go and then start building front end. So
Yeah.
getting that preview of what the data looked like
Yeah.
um, before we got too far in the design saved us a ton of thrash. Because if we
Yeah.
tried to do
Yeah.
front end work really early on,
Yeah. If we try to build it, like I could find that being really frustrating. I spent a month building this chart and then you're gonna tell me we're not even gonna use it. Like
yeah,
I
that
was
was like not a fun experience for anyone when you have to redo the designs either. So that was like a really kind of like helpful
Mhm.
outcome. I guess that came through like a ongoing series of conversations between
Yeah.
like myself and the developers working on the project.
Yeah, and it sounds like overall this kind of made the entire process a lot smoother, right? Like I get to be a bit more focused. Like if I was the engineer on this, I get to be a bit more focused on where I'm dedicating my time. And I know like I think there's something really nice about knowing that the work that you're doing is definitely gonna get the job done. Right? Where there's often times we're working in this uncertainty where we're like, we don't know if the thing that we're building is something that people are gonna like. And so having that kind of validation early on, it just empowers me to kind of like push forward even further.
When I think back on that process, it never felt that there was kind of like this like singular moment where we kind of said like, okay, the design is done,
Yeah.
go build this thing. It was like every phase of the design was sort of like done in consultation with input from our developer counterparts
Mhm.
that and there was so many things everything from like figuring out what data that we needed to track, but then other things that I wasn't necessarily thinking of just like what's the payload and size of
Yeah.
that data, and do we have to think about like load times and performance and all those sorts of things, which I'm sure is something that you probably have thought a lot about.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that we're considering when it comes to the user experience and performance is that, especially depending on the type of app that we're building, we need to take into account factors such as network speed, like how quick the internet connection is and how urgent this information is for our users.
Yeah.
And then also making sure that like we're not making our users wait for a long time. So like if we were creating like a something like YouTube, for instance, it would be so frustrating if I had to wait for the entire video to load before I even got started,
Oh my god. Yeah.
right?
It's hard to imagine what that experience would be if that's how it worked.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine YouTube being the thing that it is if that experience was like that. And one thing that is really interesting about it is we get to be a little bit clever about the way that we're loading data in that, if we're sticking with the YouTube example, when you start playing a video, it kind of knows a few things about you. Like it knows what kind of device you're pulling this from. It kind of knows how fast your internet connection is. And so we're able to kind of intelligently set a good default for, okay, we wanna ideally send this in the highest quality that works for you. But in the meantime, if these constraints don't make any sense, like if you're on a smaller screen size, maybe it doesn't make sense for us to prioritize the highest quality like resolution when it won't make that much difference to your experience, but we can get it to load immediately.
Yeah. There's so much intentionality that I think is as a user feels like something that you don't have to think about.
Yep.
But there's so much thought behind like getting the video to just like start as soon as possible. And maybe your connection is a little slower than normal because like, I don't know, your kids are downstairs also watching YouTube.
Yeah.
And then maybe they stop watching and then all of a sudden there's like this like extra increase in bandwidth and they like just seamlessly like upgrade you to like a higher quality version of the video.
Yeah.
And what I like too is that like, I don't know, if something isn't playing,
Yeah.
you can also kind of like override that and say,
Uh-huh.
I actually do want the 4K version
Yeah.
and I'm willing to wait. And
Yeah, and
you can.
I think leaving that choice for somebody with the intent to do it is a really powerful thing, right? Like, making sure that the defaults are good enough so that the majority of people have a great experience, but then also providing users the choice to customize that experience.
Yeah.
I think that there's a good balance there.
I think too, what you bring up about defaults, there's a whole bunch of other applications that I think that falls into, and it gets handled in different ways. Like, for example, if you were building like a social media app, right?
Yeah.
You want people to open it and instantly see something that's interesting to them. So obviously there's like a, like a machine learning type of thing behind the scenes that helps curate an algorithm that's going to give you stuff that you're interested in. So that is like the first thing of like, we could waste a whole bunch of bandwidth and data, like showing you stuff that you're not interested in, which like sometimes happens. But, one of the things that it makes me think about is that, like, in a kind of like a scrolling kind of
Yeah, in a feed.
in a feed sort of thing, there is, like, a very, like, sequential way that that data gets delivered to you, and even that is really interesting because it means that the algorithm is kind of, like, way ahead of you in terms of, like, queuing up a few of the other pieces of content that might be interesting to you,
Yeah.
and then rather than, you having to, like, go to the next post
Yeah.
and then wait for it to load. It's like instantly playing the moment like you scroll to it, which is also feels kind of magic, but again, very
Yeah.
intentional.
And yeah, that reminds me of this concept of, like, lazy loading and, something we call chunking, which is, basically taking trying to preload and send you enough data that you can have a good experience without loading everything all at once because we don't want this thing to slow down. And I think you can even see it sometimes when you lose your internet connection or you have a really spotty internet connection where like I'll load up an app and I can't get past the second post because nothing else is loaded.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a second, what's going on? And like it's really interesting that you don't notice these things until they go wrong. But there's so much intentionality that goes into it and making sure that that process is as smooth as possible.
One thing that I've learned too is even just about that conversation that I've as the designer have been informed by the developer to say like there's this one part of the design where we need to like go and fetch new data,
Mm.
right? And if you think back to like I don't know the internet in like the early 2000s, late 90s,
Yeah.
part of like your everyday experience when you were browsing on dial-up was like the page would load and the first thing to load would be like the lightest weight thing, which would be text. And then all of a sudden the images would be coming in. So the whole design was just like shape shifting to like
Yeah.
accommodate for new content coming in. And today, we have faster internet
Yeah.
connections and we see less of that. But there's also a lot of intentionality around like accounting for that.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that's something that you've dealt
Yeah.
with before.
This is a bit of a side note, but I couldn't help but stop thinking about, like, when in the '90s we would load something, like an image, and it would just, like, have, like, the printer logic of, like, line by line, you get your image. It's like
Progressively loading.
Um, but speaking to the point that we were talking about, like, there's something to the effect of sometimes we have constraints on what we can load and how quickly we can load them, but we can be a bit more intelligent about how we're loading them and what we show in between to make that experience feel less jarring. So in the example that you were talking about, it's a really jarring experience when you're on a website, you're looking at something and you know that the content that you want is going to be there, and then suddenly it all shifts because
Yeah.
things were still loading, and that gets really frustrating. And we sometimes make some design decisions to make that feel like less of a gap. Like sometimes we'll account for that spacing to begin with so that we're not shifting the layout.
Oh my God.
I've also seen some other techniques, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, one thing that I think, like data aside,
Mhm.
is things that you click on.
Yeah,
It's like you build up a muscle memory of like where things are,
yeah,
especially if it's a tool that you use every day. And so when there's something that like gets brought into the UI that causes something to shift, if that's something that you click on and that touch target like
yeah,
moves, that is like a pretty jarring experience. And so, yeah, there's definitely that there's value to having that conversation because if you're like this thing is going to take maybe like a split second to load, especially on a slower connection, if there's a way that we can either do the design slightly differently so that it's not jarring, or like you said, to set up like an empty container that's going to account for that data to pop in without shifting the rest of the UI. I mean, that just makes the whole experience feel a little bit more seamless.
Yeah.
But I think there's also another aspect to that, which is like thinking through loading states. And you can have skeleton loaders or spinners.
Yeah.
And
When you say skeleton loader, what do you mean by that?
so skeleton loader is kind of like where you have these kind of like different people do them different ways, but like you might have a depiction of like placeholder content. A lot of times you won't put actual text, but you'll just put like little
Little outlines.
little outlines that show kind of like where text is going to fill in. And then sometimes there's kind of like a little flashing animation of things kind of very,
Like, this thing is loading.
it kind of communicates that it's loading. And I think there are applications where that works really well. And then applications where it doesn't. And then you also have things like progress bars, which progress bars are really great when
they're progressing.
when they're progressing.
Yeah.
But a lot of progress bars, like, I don't know, I always think of like sometimes when you like update your operating system, it's like this will take 15 minutes. And then all of a sudden it's like not moving, and it's like 40 minutes later, that's when like that.
Oh, that's such a frustrating experience.
I
Like,
know.
when even when it doesn't give an indication, if there's no estimate, but it like just feels like it's not moving anywhere, that kills me.
I know, it's like it's a lot of it is about like expectation setting, which is like something that you think about on the design side. But like, if there is a way to like communicate some sense of progress to the user, that can at least feel less frustrating, because it's like it's still moving along even if it took longer than expected.
And there's like some clever solutions that you can kind of come up with for a better user experience. Like, this is a bit of a throwback, but like I remember video games used to have like crazy loading times. And one of the things that happened around the Xbox 360 generation was that in video games, you started getting loading states where it was like a little mini game of the game. So as the game is loading, you can still like interact with it.
Oh, that's cool. You like
I-
just no, it's like a bait and switch so that you don't even notice.
Well, not even a bait and switch, but just like a fun loading state. Like it kind of keeps you there and kind of keeps you engaged. I remember like there was a basketball game where between an actual game where you would playing it against another team, you would just end up in this loading state where you're just on the court by yourself and you can just shoot around and like get that feel for the hoops as the game's loading. There's another one in a game called Assassin's Creed where you get to kind of run around and kind of there's a big part of it is parkour. And so you get to still enjoy that part of the game without having to wait for the entire experience to load.
You can hone your skills and the timing of your jumps just before you actually start playing the game.
And
that's cool.
It just makes the whole experience less frustrating. Like, like especially if I'm like looking at this thing and just waiting for this thing to finally load, I might walk away and losing time for the game. And if we're thinking about this in terms of like a business and engagement, that's something that's really crucial for a product. And so like thinking about these things can help make a better product and help you achieve business goals.
And bring a little bit of joy to somebody during a pretty boring, mundane part of the experience.
Yeah. Do you have a specific piece of advice or a tip that you might want to share with our audience on something to kind of walk away with? Doesn't have to be related to this, could be related to something else, but just when you're thinking about design, what's one tip that you want people to walk away with?
I just think understanding all of the things that the people who are like bringing this to life in code are thinking about just informs so much of what you're doing in the design process. And so like if you're having this kind of like, I don't know, rigid moment in time where things start to get built, look for opportunities to just have these like lightweight conversations. Ask a lot of questions. Designers love asking questions. And so like ask the same questions to the people that you're working with, because that's kind of how you understand some of those considerations that you're thinking about, even about something like data. And then like over time, you just become so much more hyper aware that you can anticipate some of the things that someone is going to be thinking about on the other end, whether it's just like, oh, we might need an empty state here, or what happens if we don't have this? What happens if the user didn't upload an avatar? And you can sort of like be really intentional about designing, like a graceful experience that accounts for that. And over time, I find that being aware of that reduces a lot of the back and forth, because you don't want to be reactive, and you also don't want to be in the middle of like writing code and find out like, I don't know what this thing is supposed to look. And then you either take your best guess,
Yep.
or you like have to stop and wait for somebody to like design that part of the experience. So
Yeah.
talk all the time. That's my tip.
And there's something in there too with one of the examples that you shared where you were talking about all the different people that were involved in the experiment with the design system analytics, where it wasn't just an engineer, it was also a data scientist.
Yeah.
It was the designers, it was the people that were using these metrics for their design systems. Um, Being able to get some insight from each of those and bring them all into the process, I think ultimately made for a better product.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we should be thinking about a lot more.
Yeah. I think bringing anyone into that process that, um, can provide a perspective from their area of expertise that might make the end result better. It's worth making sure that those people are like engaged in the project. When I think of the example that we talked about earlier, the one that really stands out is the data scientist,
Yeah.
because being able to like actually plug the real data into an interactive visual just like increase the fidelity of visuals that we're able to put in front of a customer.
Mhm.
And I think with stuff like dashboards and stuff, it's very easy to design something like a pie chart, for example. Seems like it's going to be useful, and then all of a sudden you get like 100 slices of the pie, and it's like it's unreadable. And so
Yeah.
like just getting like those sorts of gut checks was so much quicker even than me
Yeah.
trying to like be meticulous and design out what
Yeah.
all of the full gamut of possibilities of what these visualizations could look like would be, when they could just like plug data in and like plot this on a line chart or a pie chart or what stacked bar or whatever. Yeah, that was great. So yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for talking with me, Tom. And this was Bridging the Gap. And looking forward to seeing you in the next episode.